Shaquille. Big Shaq. O'Neal thought Cedar Hills was just a quiet town, until he saw the stillness in a disabled girl's eyes, and the cruelty hiding behind perfect lawns and polished smiles. When whispers of power, silence, and corruption begin circling a girl named Luna, Shaq does what no one else dares. He listens. But what starts as simple kindness uncovers a chain of buried truths the town would kill to keep hidden. What do you do when the real bullies wear badges, carry legacies, and never raise their voices? This isn't about fists. It's about truth that won't stay quiet, and a storm that's been waiting for someone to see it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Cedar Hills wasn't the kind of town that made headlines. It wasn't loud or messy or troubled on the surface. It was the kind of place where sprinklers clicked rhythmically on perfect lawns at sunrise, where golden retrievers trotted alongside stroller-pushing parents, and where the scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air well into the afternoon. A suburban oasis, crisp, clean, and curated. The streets here curved like planned smiles, lined with pastel-colored houses that had matching shutters and porch swings that swayed with the breeze. There was always a breeze in Cedar Hills, always just enough to make you forget that not all storms were weather. The people, too, looked like they belonged to a catalog of good living. Polite nods, carpool chats, and bake sale flyers pinned to bulletin boards inside air-conditioned cafes. But underneath the well-pressed khakis and pressed smiles, Big Shaq could feel it, something unspoken, like a tightness in the air before a thunderstorm. And Shaq had lived long enough to know when the sky was holding its breath. Shaq, Big Shaq. O'Neal didn't need an introduction in Cedar Hills, or anywhere else for that matter. At 7'1", with shoulders like doorframes and a voice as deep as a canyon, he was impossible to miss. But here, he wasn't the NBA legend, or the TV personality. Here, he was simply the man who rode that custom cobalt blue bike through the town square every morning, bell chiming softly as he passed by the bagel shop, waving at the kids already lined up at the community center for tutoring. No entourage, no camera crews, just Shaq, with a small basket on his bike filled with books and boxed lunches. He lived on the quieter side of town, in a modest single-story home, with white shutters and a sprawling oak tree out front. No mansion, no marble fountains, just peace, the kind he'd earned after years of noise. He hosted reading hours at the library, showed up at town hall meetings no one else cared about, and paid for backpacks for kids whose parents didn't have enough after rent. He didn't make speeches. He didn't post about it online. He just showed up and kept showing up. That's what made him a presence, not just because of his size, but because of his constancy. To the people of Cedar Hills, Shaq was a fixture, familiar, reassuring. But what they didn't see, or perhaps chose not to, were the glances that lingered too long when a kid of a different skin tone walked into the coffee shop. They didn't notice how some kids always seemed to sit alone at recess, not because they wanted to, but because unspoken rules pushed them to the edges. And they certainly didn't talk about how some of those polite, cardigan-wearing parents whispered too easily when they thought no one was listening. Shaq noticed. Always had. He'd grown up knowing the sharp edge of quiet cruelty, the kind that dressed itself up as discipline or decorum, that smiled while slicing. He knew what it meant to be watched too closely in a store, to be talked over in a meeting, to be praised in public and pitied in private. Cedar Hills wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. It had perfected something more insidious, erasure by etiquette. And still, Shaq loved this town. Or maybe he loved the idea of it, what it could be if its silence wasn't so complicit. He had planted himself here, not just for peace, but with hope that maybe, with time he could tilt things, just a little. He had seen what a small nudge from the right heart could do. Each morning followed a ritual. Shaq would wake at sunrise, stretch under the rustle of the old oak, sip his black coffee on the porch, and read the local paper. Most headlines were harmless. New traffic light coming to Maple Drive, fundraiser for the library, annual pet parade. But lately he'd noticed the absence of certain stories. A boy caught stealing a tablet at the school library. A boy who looked like him suspended indefinitely. No mention of the kids who taunted him before he snapped. No questions asked. A girl transferred out of district for disciplinary reasons, but the whispers said she'd been targeted for months. No coverage, no community forum, just silence, neatly folded and pressed between the lines. Shaq had tried to raise concerns. Subtly, At a PTA meeting, he suggested implementing empathy workshops. Eyes glazed over. "We already do enough," someone had said. At the school board, he brought up inclusivity training. They nodded, promised to look into it, and moved on to discussing the upcoming spring carnival. Even the places that looked like progress held doors quietly shut behind red tape and polite deflections. Still, he rode his bike. Still, he waved. Because change didn't always start with a shout. Sometimes it began with showing up. Again and again, until someone couldn't unsee what they'd ignored for too long. One morning as he pedaled past the fountain in the town square, he saw something new. A girl, maybe 11 or 12, sitting alone in a wheelchair with a sketch pad in her lap. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was just still. Like the world moved too fast around her, and she'd learned to stay anchored by becoming stone. She didn't look up. Not at the birds, not at the breeze, not at him. Her hair was tied back in a lopsided braid, and her socks were mismatched, one striped, one plain. The kind of detail only someone looking hard would notice. Shaq noticed. He didn't stop. Not that day. Just rode by, slower than usual, eyes meeting hers for half a second. It was enough to see there was something behind that stillness, something watching, waiting. The next day she was there again. Same spot, same stillness, different drawing. This time he caught a glimpse, a sketch of a tree with birds flying away from it. One bird had a cracked wing, still flying. Shaq nodded at her. She didn't nod back, but her pencil paused for a moment. In the days that followed, this became part of the ritual. Coffee, paper, ride, Luna, that's what her name tag said, stitched onto her faded backpack one morning. No last name, just Luna, a name that felt fitting, distant, luminous, quietly orbiting. The town kept spinning. Baristas served oat milk lattes with perfect foam hearts. Soccer moms discussed fundraisers. Teenagers with AirPods drifted past in clouded groups. But Shaq's gaze kept returning to the girl at the fountain, because there was something about her silence that reminded him of his own. One afternoon, as he parked his bike and walked toward the library, he noticed two boys, both in uniformed polo shirts from the local academy, standing too close to Luna's bench. They weren't touching her, weren't even speaking loudly, but their posture was sharp, like they were saying things with their presence that words didn't need to complete. Luna didn't react, didn't flinch, but Shaq's pace slowed. His eyes narrowed. The boys walked off as soon as he got closer. One of them tossed a smirk over his shoulder. Shaq didn't confront. Not yet. But his jaw set tighter than usual. Because that look, that smirk was the kind of thing that came from confidence built on impunity. Back at home, Shaq sat on his porch longer than usual. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows over the lawn. He sipped the last of his coffee cold, staring out at nothing in particular. He thought about how many times he'd told himself not to get involved, not to stir things, not to make noise in a place that preferred quiet. But the noise had already begun. Not loud, not obvious, just the low hum of something wrong, ignored too long. Cedar Hills wasn't broken. Not visibly, but it was slipping, not in explosions, but in fractures, in tiny silent permissions, granted every day. Shaq didn't have a plan yet, didn't know what would happen next. But as he locked his bike that night and turned off the porch light, one thing was certain. The quiet was over. Because even in a town that looked perfect on the outside, a single act of courage or cruelty could change everything. And Shaq had seen enough to know the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. It had just been smiling the whole time. The morning came alive with warmth. The kind of warmth that made spring in Cedar Hills feel like a reward after the stale gray of winter. The sun perched comfortably in a sky so clean it looked hand-painted, and the leaves on the trees danced with just enough breeze to whisper but not shout. It was the kind of day where life felt on schedule, where coffee brewed just right, and traffic lights seemed to favor you for no reason. Shaq rode his bike through the town square, his wheels humming softly against the pavement, the smell of blooming jasmine and fresh-cut grass wrapping around him like a familiar song. But this morning something was different. Something or someone pulled his eyes off the path. She sat alone by the fountain. At first glance you might have missed her. A small girl, no more than 11 or 12, almost swallowed up by the shadow of the marble lions perched on the fountain's edge. Her wheelchair barely made a sound against the stone ground, and her body language said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned that saying it didn't always matter. Her head bent low over a sketch pad resting across her lap, fingers stained faintly with charcoal and blue pastel dust. It wasn't just the way she looked, thin, pale, tucked into herself. It was the stillness around her. It was heavy, like the space she occupied had forgotten how to breathe. Shaq slowed down, one foot pressing lightly to the curb. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just watched her, feeling the pull of her presence before he even understood why. She didn't look up, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge him, but there was something in that moment, as if the air between them recognized a shared frequency. He took one more glance and rode on, but he felt that stillness follow him long after the fountain faded from his rear view. The next day she was there again. Same spot, same silence. This time, Shaq walked his bike slowly across the park and sat on a bench nearby. He didn't stare, just existed in the same space. Occasionally, his eyes drifted to her hands, precise, deliberate, dragging color across paper with an intensity far older than her age. The picture she was drawing was abstract at first, but then it came into focus. A tree, roots twisted and black, branches unraveling like veins into a sky on fire. Not a child's drawing, not even close. It was emotion in shape and pigment, and it hit him harder than he expected. He'd seen a lot of talent in his life. He'd known prodigies, but this wasn't about skill. It was about pain, or maybe survival through art. The day after that, she had a new drawing. A lone bird, perched on a power line with rain pouring around it, feathers sagging but eyes wide open. She didn't draw for attention. She didn't check to see who noticed. She just kept going, like this was the only voice she had left. Shaq wondered if anyone else had ever seen these pages, these private echoes of a child who had clearly lived far too much, far too young. It wasn't long before he learned her name. A small tag stitched into the side of her backpack, half faded. Luna. No last name, no details. Just Luna. It suited her in ways he couldn't explain. Ethereal, drifting just outside the gravity of the world. She didn't speak to him, didn't ask questions, didn't show curiosity. But each day he sat closer. Sometimes on the same bench, sometimes just across the fountain. Their connection wasn't formed in words. It was built on proximity, on silent respect. And as the days turned into a rhythm, Shaq began to notice more than just her art. He noticed how others noticed her, or more precisely, how they didn't. Mothers pulled their kids subtly to the other side of the path when passing her. Teenagers walked past with barely veiled glances, sometimes laughing under their breath. He caught one woe snapping a picture of her with his phone, quickly tucking it away when he saw Shaq watching. There was no outright cruelty, nothing over, just that subtle, suffocating rejection, the kind that taught someone they didn't belong without ever needing to say it out loud. He started asking questions. Quiet ones. At the library, he asked the front desk clerk, a middle-aged woman named Karen, who had an encyclopedic memory for local gossip, if she knew the girl by the fountain. Her face twitched. That's Luna. Poor thing. Her mom keeps to herself, moved here a few years ago. Girl's always sketching, never talks. Some say she's troubled, but sweet, you know. Just different. The word different hung in the air like smoke. Shaq didn't like it, not because it was wrong, but because it was a label people used when they didn't want to deal with the truth. At the community center, he asked one of the youth counselors. Yeah, I've seen her, the guy said, glancing toward the front windows. She's in the school program, but doesn't really participate. Some of the other kids mess with her. Nothing serious. You know how kids are. Shaq knew exactly how kids were, and more importantly, how adults let them be. He began to piece together a quiet map of Luna's existence. Her mother worked long shifts at the local diner, rarely seen outside of work. Luna went to the town's only middle school, a place with crisp uniforms and tight discipline, but a reputation for brushing things under the rug if they didn't fit the image. Luna's disability, paired with her silence, had made her an easy target, one of those invisible students who walked hallways as ghosts. Teachers didn't bother, administrators didn't follow up, and peers either mocked her or ignored her completely. It was a vacuum of care, and no one noticed or wanted to. What disturbed Shaq the most wasn't what Luna endured. It was how well she carried it, as if she expected nothing else, as if she had already accepted her place on the margins, and that, more than anything, pulled at him in places he hadn't visited in years. One afternoon, he watched as a group of older girls walked past Luna near the fountain. Their chatter was loud, performative, and as they passed, one of them made an exaggerated sniffing noise. "Something smells sad," she giggled, not looking back. Luna didn't react. Her pencil never paused, but Shaq saw it, the way her shoulders curled just slightly inward. The kind of reaction that had been trained over time, not by one event, but by 100 tiny cuts. He got up, walked toward them, not with anger, but with a calm so heavy it turned heads. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call them out. He simply walked past them, standing tall, presence commanding. They fell silent as he passed. No smirks this time, just unease. Shaq sat near Luna, not saying anything. After a few minutes, she looked up at him for the first time. Really looked. Her eyes weren't wide with fear or gratitude. They were measured. She was trying to figure him out, as if wondering what he wanted in return for his presence. When she saw nothing expected in his face, she nodded once, a fraction of movement. Then she returned to her drawing, this time of a cracked statue standing in a field of wildflowers. Shaq stayed with her until the shadows stretched long and the air cooled. When she packed up her sketchpad and rolled herself toward the sidewalk, she paused near him and looked up once more. "You don't have to sit with me," she said, her voice soft, hoarse like it hadn't been used much lately. It was the first thing she'd said. Shaq smiled, eyes steady. "I know," he said. And that was it. That was the beginning. In the days that followed, things shifted. He brought her sketch pencils from the art store, left anonymously on the fountain bench. She found them but never acknowledged them aloud. She began leaving her completed sketches tucked beneath the bench for him to find. Images that told stories deeper than any essay could. One was of a girl in a wheelchair atop a cliff, holding lightning in her fist. Another was of a bear standing over a broken house, sheltering the girl inside it from rain. They didn't speak often. They didn't need to. But their silence became a thread, one of understanding, respect, and something that felt like trust. But not everything was quiet. Shaq noticed the changes. Subtle, but real. A group of boys began lurking around the fountain, more often, laughing louder, watching Luna from a distance. One afternoon, he arrived to find Luna already gone. Her usual spot empty, but a crumpled drawing half trampled under a sneaker mark. It was one of her darker pieces, a girl caged inside a school, surrounded by laughing shadows. He picked it up, smoothed it out carefully, and sat for a long time, eyes scanning the park. He knew what this was turning into. He had felt it before, in locker rooms, in classrooms, in boardrooms. The way power cloaked itself in jokes, in tradition, in dismissive laughter. He had spent years battling giants, but the most dangerous monsters he'd met wore polite smiles and ran PTA meetings. Luna didn't need saving. She needed seeing. She needed someone who wouldn't flinch from her silence. Someone who'd hold a mirror to the world and say, "This is what you've chosen to ignore." And Shaq? He'd made his choice. He wasn't here just to ride bikes and read books. He was here for the girl by the fountain, and for everything she represented. Something had already begun, and there was no slowing it now. Because in a town built on image, truth was the most disruptive force of all. And Luna, with her pencil in her silence, was about to draw it out. Shaq had always believed in meeting young people where they were. For some, it was in community centers or gyms. For others, it was behind a sketchbook, like Luna. But now, it was inside the polished hallways of Cedar Hills Academy, a school known more for its rankings and alumni lists than the emotional temperature within its walls. He'd agreed to be a guest mentor through a town-sponsored youth development program, one designed to promote resilience and leadership among students. The brochures used words like empowerment and equity, but words he'd learned were easy. Real equity was quieter, harder, and most often avoided. From the outside, the school looked like an elite prep institution: brick arches, clean lawns, banners hanging with school colors. Inside, the ceilings were high, lockers pristine, and walls adorned with photos of award-winning students. But the atmosphere hummed with something Shaq couldn't quite name at first. It was too quiet, too perfect, like a showroom meant to impress rather than a place where kids were allowed to grow, falter, and be human. His visit started with classroom drop-ins. He observed student council discussions, joined a creative writing workshop, and even sat in during science lab presentations. Administrators smiled tightly as they escorted him around, pointing out successful students like they were museum pieces. But what Shaq was looking for wasn't framed on the walls or listed on the honor roll. He looked between the moments, the glances, the silences, The uncomfortable jokes that slipped between sentences. That's where the real story lived. He first spotted Chase Danner during a leadership seminar on conflict resolution. Tall, well-dressed, and brimming with a performative charm, Chase commanded the room with the ease of someone who had been told he mattered more than others. He introduced himself to Shaq with a firm handshake and a confident grin. "My dad says you were a legend," he said smoothly. "Cool that you're doing this kind of work now." His voice held just the right amount of admiration to pass for sincerity, but his eyes were too still, too calculating. Shaq had met enough politicians in his day to recognize the next generation of one. Over the next few visits, Shaq began to notice a pattern. Chase had a group, 3 other students who orbited him like satellites. There was Brody, loud and quick with sarcasm. Kennedy, a master of backhanded compliments and sweet-toned insults. And Griffin, who rarely spoke but always watched, documenting everything with unnerving focus. Together, they moved through the school like royalty, not with brute force but with entitlement wrapped in likability. Teachers laughed at their jokes. Other students either tried to join them or avoided them entirely. They didn't break rules, they bent them gracefully, just enough to avoid correction. And then there was Luna. She sat alone in the art room, during free period, sketching while others scrolled through phones or grouped up in corners. Her presence in the school was barely acknowledged. Some students stared, some whispered, most ignored. But Chase and his crew had taken notice, not because she posed any threat, but because she didn't play the game. She didn't seek approval, didn't try to blend in, didn't entertain them. And in their world, difference wasn't just uncomfortable, it was offensive. Shaq began noticing Luna's demeanor shift when they crossed paths at school. Outside in the park, she held a quiet kind of strength. Here it was buried beneath layers of defense. Eyes lowered, shoulders tense, sketches rushed. One afternoon, he saw her exiting the cafeteria with juice spilled down her lap. A teacher nearby scolded her for being clumsy. She didn't argue, just wheeled away. Later that day, he overheard Chase in the hallway, reenacting a scene with exaggerated flailing. "Oops, my bad. Guess some people should get training wheels for their wheelchairs." Laughter followed, not loud, but sharp, the kind that left bruises even if no one touched you. Shaq's hands clenched, but he said nothing. Not yet. He began documenting patterns. Not to build a case, but to understand the terrain. Pranks during group projects, where Luna's name was left off. School announcements that included every art award winner except her, even when her work was featured. Rumors quietly planted that she was unstable, that she'd been expelled before, that her mother was off. All baseless, but in this ecosystem, truth was less important than perception, and perception was something Chase had mastered. One day, during a mentoring circle session, Shaq was leading a discussion on empathy. The students had been split into small groups to share a time they'd felt misunderstood. Shaq wandered between circles, listening. When he passed Chase's group, he paused. Griffin was speaking. "I guess I don't like when people assume I'm quiet because I don't care. I just like watching people." Brody added, "I hate when teachers act like they know our lives. Like, sorry, you don't know me outside this building." Chase leaned back, arms crossed. "I think people need to chill with this victim complex stuff. Not everything's oppression. Sometimes people are just weird. Doesn't mean everyone else is a bully." The group nodded too easily. Shaq didn't react, but he clocked the message loud and clear. The turning point came in the cafeteria. It was a Friday. Rain streaked the windows, and students buzzed with weekend energy. Shaq had arrived early and sat in the staff area, near the back. Observing, he spotted Luna at a table, near the exit, as usual. Alone, tray untouched. Across the room, Chase and his circle huddled over their phones, whispering, laughing. Then Brody stood up, carrying a tray toward Luna's table. He stopped behind her, tapped her shoulder, and when she turned, he accidentally dropped a pudding cup into her lap. Gasps. Stifled laughter. The teacher on lunch duty looked up too late. Luna sat frozen, eyes wide, not from surprise but from the familiar rhythm of it all. This wasn't new. It was just more public. Her fingers clenched the table edge. Shaq rose from his seat. Before he could reach her, Chase appeared at her side, offering napkins with exaggerated politeness. "Oh no. So sorry," he said, voice dipped in sugar. "Accidents happen, right?" Luna didn't respond. She took the napkins, wiped her lap, and rolled out slowly, her back stiff, movements robotic. The teacher finally arrived. Confused, asking what happened. Chase smiled. She bumped the table. No big deal. The teacher shrugged. All right. Clean up and sit down. Shaq stood in the middle of it, watching the pieces settle back into place like it never happened. That was the final straw. After school he met with the principal, a well-groomed man named Mr. Calhoun, who carried himself like a politician in training. Shaq laid out what he'd seen, the pattern, the targeted cruelty. Calhoun nodded sympathetically but raised his hands. We take bullying very seriously, but if the student in question hasn't filed a formal complaint, there's little we can do. These are sensitive matters. Shaq leaned forward. It's only sensitive if we pretend it's isolated. It's not. Calhoun's expression didn't change. You have to understand, these are influential families, and sometimes what looks like bullying is just social dynamics. That phrase, social dynamics, stuck with Shaq long after he left the office. He sat in his truck staring at the rain as it tapped the windshield like a ticking clock. He thought about Luna's silence, her drawings, the bruises that didn't show, and he thought about all the times in his own life where people like Calhoun smiled, while the ground cracked underneath someone else's feet. He'd seen enough. Policy might have tied his hands, but his voice was still free, and he had a platform, one much bigger than the school could contain. He wasn't gonna shout. Not yet, but he would act. And the first step was simple. He would make sure Luna knew she wasn't invisible anymore. Because once someone like Shaq started seeing the shadows, it was only a matter of time before the whole school had to see them too. Shaq had learned to read between the lines of small-town pleasantries. He'd lived long enough to know that truth rarely arrived in a straight line. In places like Cedar Hills, it slipped out sideways, carried in offhand remarks, darting glances, and the silences that stretched just a beat too long. After what happened in the cafeteria, after Luna rolled out with that pudding-stained tray and no one flinched, Shaq decided it wasn't enough to watch anymore. He had to dig. He started small, weaving questions into casual conversation. At the local hardware store, he asked about the Danner family, just enough curiosity to seem harmless. Chase's dad still in politics, he'd say while paying for a set of replacement bike lights. The clerk, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and a handshake like dry bark, gave a half smile. Still pulling the strings, far as I know. Randall Danner don't just retire, he multiplied. At the community center, he leaned into the social circle of older volunteers, the ones who knew the town's history better than the library did. Over puzzles and coffee they talked. Not openly, but suggestively. One woman, Janice, offered, "Used to be a good man, Randall, before he got that seat in county council. Now, he's all polished teeth and threats wrapped in ribbon." Another whispered, "He got that big construction contract approved faster than you can blink. Coincidence? Maybe. But maybe not." Shaq listened, took mental notes. He started building a web, not just of names but of implications. Luna's name never came up directly, but it didn't take long before her connection surfaced. One afternoon, over lunch with Daryl Simmons, a retired cop and one of Shaq's few close friends in town, things shifted. "You still mentoring at that school?" Daryl asked, sipping his iced tea, brow furrowed. "Yeah, been checking in more regular lately," Shaq replied. Daryl hesitated, fingers drumming the tabletop. "There's a kid there. Girl. Luna, right?" Shaq nodded once. Daryl leaned in. "Her daddy. He wasn't some deadbeat who ran off, like folks say. He was a city code inspector. Smart, precise. Too precise. He filed a report about illegal zoning deals tied to a housing development project. Guess who owned the company?" "Randall Danner," Shaq said, not as a question. "Exactly. Guy vanished 2 weeks after he filed a complaint. No body, no note. Just gone. Whole thing buried under a police mental health episode label. Only reason I know is 'cause I saw the original report. Before it disappeared." Shaq's stomach tightened, and no one said anything. Daryl shrugged grimly. "You think anyone's gonna go toe-to-toe with a Danner? Man funds half the town's budget, puts politicians in office, gets judges re-elected. You cross him, you vanish. Or worse, you lose everything piece by piece, until you wish you had. And Luna? She and her mama been ghosts. Ever since. Live in that broken-down unit off Lexington. She was 7 when he disappeared. Her mom don't talk to nobody. Don't even come to town meetings. Just keeps her head down." The room seemed smaller. Suddenly, The quiet around Luna wasn't just social cruelty. It was engineered neglect, deliberate invisibility. That night, Shaq sat on his porch longer than usual. He didn't sip coffee, didn't scroll his phone. He just sat, watching the shadows of branches sway across his front yard, like restless ghosts. The line between playground teasing and generational corruption had blurred. The names etched on donation plaques and golden awards at the school were the same ones behind the silence. The cruelty wasn't random, it was a smokescreen. And Luna, she was collateral. The next day, Shaq's bike had a flat tire. Not an ordinary puncture. The valve stem had been ripped out. Clean. Deliberate. The kind of thing that said, "We know you're looking." He didn't panic, didn't react. He walked the bike home and fixed it in silence. 2 days later, a folded piece of paper appeared on his doorstep. No envelope. No name. Just 4 words in blocky capital letters. "Stay in your lane." The ink was fresh. The edges of the paper hadn't even curled yet. Shaq turned it over, then tore it clean down the middle, and dropped it in the recycling bin. He wasn't about to flinch because someone didn't want their sins remembered. But this wasn't the kind of threat he could ignore. He didn't have proof. No camera. No witness. Just shadows thickening around every step he took. At the mentoring sessions, he began noticing the way certain students watched him, ones connected to Chase. They didn't act out, they just observed, like chess players calculating moves, 3 turns ahead.
Luna, on the other hand, had become even quieter. Her sketches grew darker. One showed a girl in a boat, surrounded by water shaped like hands trying to pull her under. Another was a cracked mask floating above a classroom with no windows. Shaq didn't ask what they meant. He didn't need to. Her silence said everything.
At the library, he asked around subtly if anyone remembered the whistleblower case. Most didn't. A few furrowed their brows. One older man said, "Wasn't there a guy who got lost in the woods? Or something. Sad story." But no one remembered the details. And that's what frightened Shaq the most. The town had forgotten because forgetting was easier than remembering who allowed it. Late one evening, as he left a school board meeting, where his suggestion for a student support liaison had been politely dismissed, Shaq found a message carved into the hood of his truck. Not deep, but clear enough to read under the streetlight. "You don't belong." It wasn't about race. Not entirely. It was about power, who held it, and who dared challenge it. He didn't file a police report. He knew better. Danner's reach stretched across departments. Maybe not directly, but through favors owed, careers protected, and networks too loyal to untangle. He'd seen the same machinery operate in bigger cities. Only with more polish, Cedar Hills just wore a smaller mask. At home, he pulled out Luna's earliest sketch, the one of the tree with birds flying from it. He studied it longer this time. One of the branches had a bird perched upside down, like it had tried to leave and been caught, trapped not by chains, but by roots pretending to hold it safely. Shaq finally understood. This wasn't just about bullies. It wasn't about a cruel boy named Chase, or a cowardly principal, or whispered gossip. It was about systems, the kind of systems that wore suits and shook hands while quietly exiling those who questioned them. Luna's father had tried to break that silence. He paid the price. Now Luna was living in the echo of that decision. And Shaq, by stepping into her world, by asking questions no one else wanted answered, was drawing attention. The wrong kind. At a charity breakfast, he noticed Councilman Danner speaking to the mayor, pausing just long enough to glance across the room at him. It wasn't a hostile look. It was worse. It was condescending. The look of someone who knew the weight of their influence and found your resistance amusing. Shaq held his stare until Danner looked away. Not because he was rattled, but because bullies only hold power in the silence of others. And Shaq was done being quiet. Still, he knew what was coming. You don't tug at the threads of a well-tailored lie without the whole suit trying to swallow you. And in Cedar Hills, appearance was everything. As the days passed, subtle disruptions followed. The local paper, which had once featured Shaq's mentoring work on the front page, now ran a short column questioning the ideological slant of celebrity activism. His speaking event at the community center was postponed due to a scheduling conflict, though no new date was offered. Even the librarian, once warm and chatty, now offered only tight smiles. It wasn't overt, it wasn't violent, but it was pressure measured and precise. Still, Shaq didn't back down. He adjusted. He started keeping records, notes, names. Interactions. He stopped walking into meetings empty-handed and began bringing Luna's drawings as quiet evidence. He showed them to people he trusted, not for sympathy, but for impact. The kind of impact that made people question what they thought they knew. Because sometimes art could say what reports couldn't. And in the midst of the warnings, the vandalism, the chilling glances, Shaq found his purpose sharpening. Luna had lived in the crosshairs of this machinery her whole life, and she hadn't broken. She had drawn. She had endured. That kind of strength didn't need saving. It needed amplifying. The line between childhood cruelty and generational corruption wasn't a line at all. It was a bridge, and Shaq was ready to cross it, even if it meant walking into the storm with nothing but truth in his hands and a girl's drawings in his heart. There's a particular kind of quiet in towns like Cedar Hills, a curated, composed stillness that isn't peace but performance. It looks like safety. It sounds like harmony, but it hums always with the low voltage of something being hidden. Shaq had lived in cities where injustice screamed. In Cedar Hills it whispered. And now that he'd begun listening, he realized the silence was anything but accidental. It was engineered. The deeper he went, the more deliberate the silence became. After the vandalism, the threats and the soft cell warnings disguised as friendly advice, Shaq knew he was approaching something the town didn't want touched. Luna's sketches still haunted him. Images of crumbling buildings with hollow faces in the windows, playgrounds overgrown with thorny vines, hands reaching out from under classroom desks. They weren't just drawings. They were evidence, symbols of a disease the town had dressed in honor rolls and PTA potlucks. He began gathering more than impressions. This time he wanted paper trails. It started with a chance conversation with a substitute teacher at a local coffee shop. Shaq casually asked how the school was handling discipline these days. The teacher, unaware of the weight behind the question, shrugged. Depends on the kid. Some get sent home for chewing gum. Others, well, if your dad donated the library. Let's just say you get a few more second chances. That was the thread. Shaq went back through archived news clippings, publicly available school board records, PTA meeting minutes. He found names, incidents, a pattern. Students from certain families with disciplinary flags that never made it into official reports, missing complaint forms, vague summaries of incidents with no follow-up. He remembered a case he'd overheard during his first week in town, about a sophomore who transferred schools abruptly after a conflict in the locker room. The details were never made public, but the boy's father had tried to press charges. Weeks later, the family moved. The boy had never spoken publicly, and the official record stated it was a personal relocation. Shaq tracked the father down through a church registry and called. The man answered, but the moment Shaq introduced himself, the line went cold. "I'm sorry," the voice said. "We've moved on. Please don't contact us again." And the call ended. Next, Shaq reached out to a former school counselor who had quietly resigned last year. Her name was Lauren Haskins. She'd worked at Cedar Hills Academy for 8 years, had glowing reviews, then left suddenly. No explanation given. Shaq found her through a mutual contact in his mentorship circle and arranged a discreet meeting at a diner 30 minutes outside town. She looked tired. Not old, just worn down in a way that made her look smaller than her frame. Her hands stayed around her coffee mug like it was a shield. "I knew someone would come asking eventually," she said, eyes scanning the room. "What happened?" Shaq asked, his voice low. Lauren let out a breath. "I tried to file an internal report. There were too many complaints. Students being isolated, harassed, excluded. But they all had something in common. Their bullies were kids with names that mattered. Danner, Ellison, Cartwright. I was told to focus on emotional resilience strategies instead of pointing fingers." "Who told you?" "Principal Calhoun, and someone from the district office." The wording was polite, but the message was clear. "I either fell in line, or I found a new job. I chose the second." Shaq took notes, not for evidence yet, but to chart the landscape. What he saw now wasn't just about Luna. It was systemic. It was calculated. Every complaint buried wasn't an oversight. It was policy disguised as discretion. He expanded his reach, talking to janitors, crossing guards, even local delivery drivers who had access to campus grounds and teacher lounges. The stories emerged like fragments of a puzzle. A freshman who cried in the nurse's office daily, but was written off as sensitive. A theater kid whose props were destroyed before the school play incident, marked as accidental. A girl who stopped showing up to school entirely. her mother never returning calls, each one tied, subtly or directly, to students in the same protected circle. Shaq created a private file on his laptop, coded entries, dates, names, notes. He wasn't ready to go public. Not yet. He needed the right moment, the right frame, something that couldn't be dismissed as overreaction. But the deeper he went, the more resistance pushed back. His local mentee group started thinning. Parents pulled their kids without explanation. His weekly story time at the library was temporarily paused for program reshuffling. He'd once been greeted with hugs and handshakes in grocery store aisles. Now people turned away politely, suddenly remembering something on the next shelf. Even some of the kids he'd mentored, the ones who once clung to his words, now kept their distance. Not out of betrayal but fear. They'd learned the rules. Align with power, or disappear. He approached Principal Calhoun again, this time with specific examples, names, patterns. "I have documentation," Shaq said evenly. "Not hearsay, not guesses. These are student reports and community testimonies." Calhoun didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He simply folded his hands on the desk and smiled faintly. "Shaquille, I know you care deeply, but sometimes passion can blind us to nuance. These are children. They're still learning. We can't treat every teenage slight like a federal case." "Yeah." Shaq leaned forward. "So we wait until someone ends up in a hospital? Or worse?" "You're a public figure," Calhoun said, a slight edge creeping into his tone. "You have influence. Use it wisely." The meeting ended in silence, but Shaq left knowing exactly what that edge meant. He was stepping into territory they thought untouchable. Later that week, Luna's mother left a package on Shaq's porch. No note. Inside was a folder, old, weathered, but protected. Inside were scanned copies of her husband's final report. Zoning violations, falsified safety inspections, forged signatures. One signature stood out. Randall Danner's. It was buried deep in a transfer authorization, masked as routine. There was also a single-page letter her husband had written, never sent, addressed to the school board. It warned of favoritism, of overlooked abuse, of the quiet culture being cultivated behind closed doors. That letter was dated 2 weeks before his disappearance. Shaq sat at his desk, surrounded by sketches, and files, and stories. The weight of it all wasn't crushing, but it was defining. Cedar Hills was never meant to be examined. Its shine was a distraction, its warmth, a performance, and under it all was rot. But change wasn't about storms and speeches. It was about exposure, slow, steady, undeniable. He wasn't chasing revenge. He wasn't here to tear down reputations. He was here to unmask the machine that fed on silence, to honor the voices that were drowned, to show Luna she wasn't alone, and never had been. And when that mask finally fell, he wanted the whole town to see exactly what they'd been applauding all along. It was the kind of day that fooled people into thinking the world was all right. The sky stretched wide, cloudless and clean. The sun filtered through the trees like golden thread, catching on the edges of park benches and bouncing off the polished marble of the town fountain. Cedar Hills was at its most convincing when the weather cooperated. Families wandered the walking trail. Kids zipped by on scooters. Dogs tugged on leashes toward smells only they could find. The air was filled with just enough sound to create the illusion of joy. Bike bells, distant laughter, shoes on gravel paths. But beneath that beautiful hum, something sharper waited. Shaq had learned to feel shifts in the air long before they arrived. It wasn't mystical, it was experience. You don't survive locker rooms, boardrooms, and political rooms without developing that sixth sense. The kind that tells you when something's about to twist. He was leaning against his bike near the edge of the park, watching the light shift through the trees, when the change arrived. Subtle, but real. It started with a ripple in the rhythm. A cluster of teens had gathered near the west path. Too loud, too performative. He recognized them before he even saw their faces. Chase Danner, flanked by Brody and Griffin, holding court like always. They stood beside a makeshift path, marked with plastic cones. Someone must have stolen from the nearby construction site. 2 cafeteria trays were laid flat on the ground like starting blocks. Shaq narrowed his eyes. That's when he saw her. Luna, at the edge of the circle, her wheelchair locked, sketchpad pressed against her chest. Her shoulders were stiff, her face unreadable, but her silence was louder than the laughter echoing around her. Chase stepped forward, smiling that trademark smile. the one that played well in school photos and political fundraisers. In his hand was a bicycle helmet, ridiculously oversized, bright pink with glitter stars. "Come, Luna," he called, voice high and cheerful. "We're trying to make things inclusive, right?" Brody snorted. Griffin filmed. They hadn't touched her, not physically, but they didn't need to. The stage was theirs, the joke already scripted. They put the helmet on a garden statue, fastened it loosely, then mimicked pushing imaginary wheels. Chase leaned into an exaggerated pose, hands curved like he was maneuvering a wheelchair, tongue out, wobbling dramatically. "First to the fountain wins. Let's roll." Laughter exploded. Sharp, short, cruel. No one watching moved. No parents stepped forward. No jogger paused. Even the dog walkers looked down. Shaq didn't shout. He didn't storm. He didn't run. He simply walked. The moment they saw him towering, calm, coming down the path like gravity made flesh, the laughter broke. Not completely. Not honestly. It cracked like glass beneath feet that weren't sure how much weight they could put down. Chase turned first, instinctively straightening his spine. "Hey, Mr. O'Neill. We were Shaq didn't stop. He didn't speak. He walked directly between them, slow and steady, his presence drawing the air out of the park like a vacuum. Chase's voice trailed off. Brody backed up. Griffin lowered the phone, suddenly unsure if filming was smart. Shaq didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was the roar. It filled the space between them with something far heavier than words: accountability and fear. The honest kind. The kind they didn't feel when mocking from the safety of numbers and privilege. He stepped past them and came to a stop beside Luna. She hadn't moved. Her hands still held her sketch pad tightly, knuckles pale. But when she finally looked up, there was no surprise in her eyes. Just exhaustion. Recognition. This wasn't new for her. This wasn't the first time someone had laughed at her pain. And it wouldn't be the last. Her gaze met Shaq's and held there. Steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But she did. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "It doesn't stop them. You know that, right?" Shaq nodded slowly. "I know." Her eyes dropped back to her lap, and her fingers loosened around the sketch pad. A gust of wind tugged at the paper, threatening to lift it, but she held on. Behind them, Chase and his crew had scattered, retreating in awkward steps, trying to look casual as they moved toward the parking lot. But they didn't run. That would have meant guilt. They strolled, pretending they were never there, pretending nothing had happened. Shaq watched them go, but didn't chase them. Not yet. This wasn't about punishment, it was about presence, about making it impossible to pretend no one saw. Later that day, he walked Luna home. Not all the way, just far enough that the gesture wouldn't embarrass her. But the message would be clear. Along the way, they passed 3 families who looked away too fast. A teacher from the school who offered a stiff wave, and a boy from Luna's class who crossed the street without making eye contact. "I don't think they like me," she muttered. Shaq smiled without amusement. "You make them uncomfortable. People don't like being reminded of what they ignore." She didn't answer, but for the first time she smiled. Barely, but enough to notice. That night, Shaq sat on his porch, reviewing the footage. He'd installed small cams around the park days ago, anticipating something like this. The video was clean. Faces visible. Voices clear. He didn't plan to share it yet. He wasn't interested in internet outrage. He wanted something more enduring. But as he watched the moment where Chase tossed the glitter helmet into the air like a trophy, something shifted inside him. The casual cruelty, the laughter, the indifference of the bystanders. It all piled onto a single truth. This wasn't about bullies. This was about a culture that let them flourish. The wind had changed that day, not just in the park, but in Shaq's purpose. He'd come to Cedar Hills for peace. He'd stayed for the community. But now he was here for justice. Quiet, relentless, unavoidable. Luna had stopped believing anyone could really stop it. But Shaq wasn't there to stop it. He was there to make sure the town had no choice but to see it. And once seen, it couldn't be ignored again. The breeze had shifted again, cooler now, as if the town could sense that something in its rhythm had been interrupted. The trees whispered louder, the light felt sharper, and the birds didn't sing so easily in the morning. Shaq felt it too, but he didn't let on. He moved through his days with quiet precision, a routine unchanged, to the eyes of those watching. But under the surface he was setting something in motion, something that wouldn't be as easily ignored as a drawing or a rumor, or a girl's silence. He started with the park, not the whole stretch, just the areas that mattered, the fountain where Luna usually sat, the path near the benches where Chase and his crew often gathered, and the small strip by the trash bins where most of their pranks began. He'd chosen the cameras carefully, discreet, motion activated, low light capable. Technology had come a long way since the days of grainy tape and visible red lights. These devices were almost invisible, even to trained eyes, and Shaq had installed them alone, under the cover of pre-dawn silence, when the town still slept and the only sound was the soft hiss of sprinklers turning. Next came the school entrance. He couldn't access the inside legally, and he wasn't looking to break rules, but the outer gates, the perimeter fence, the rear lot where students loitered before the bell rang, those were public enough, and just far enough outside administrative control that he could make his move. The cameras here were angled sharply, capturing not just faces but body language, positioning, timing. Shaq wasn't looking for dramatic confessions. He was looking for patterns. And within 3 days, the patterns began to emerge. The first clip showed Chase dropping a small object into a student's backpack. Gum, from the looks of it. Minutes later, the same student was sent to the office for tampering with school property. Coincidence? Maybe. But the next clip wasn't so easy to dismiss. A different student, this one known to sit near Luna in art class, found a flurry of glitter dumped into his locker, a textbook vandalized. When he complained, nothing happened. He stopped speaking to Luna after that, avoided her in the hallways. Chase and Brody were seen walking away from the scene moments before the incident, one of them snapping his fingers like signaling a job complete. By day 5, Shaq had collected over a dozen clips. They didn't scream abuse, they whispered it. A tap of a foot to trip someone walking by. A shoulder nudge during lunch. Notes slipped onto desks with scribbled threats. The worst part, the teachers. They saw it, not always directly, but they saw enough. And when they did, they looked away, or smiled nervously. Or worse, offered shallow discipline that never reached paper. They weren't villains. They were participants in the architecture of avoidance. Shaq didn't confront them. Not yet. He was gathering weight. Truth in a place like Cedar Hills had to be undeniable to make a dent. The final recording broke something in him. It came from a school field trip, an annual eco-awareness day, organized by the academy, where middle schoolers were bused to a local nature reserve, just outside town. Parents were encouraged to volunteer, teachers assigned as group leaders, and students were given partner assignments for the afternoon hike. Shaq wasn't there in person, but he'd placed a small clip-on camera on Luna's chair the day before, disguised in the frame of a new phone holder she'd attached to draw landscapes. She hadn't asked questions, just nodded when he offered it. The footage started off normal. Students gathering, chatter, laughter. Then came the hike. Groups broke off into pairs. Luna, as always, ended up without one. The footage showed her trailing behind, her wheels crunching through the dirt unevenly. The others pulled ahead. The teachers, occupied with louder kids, didn't look back. Then, slowly, her path diverged. Not by accident. Chase walked alongside her for a moment, pointing toward a different fork in the trail. "Shortcut," he said, loud enough to catch the audio. "You'll like the view." She veered that way. No one stopped her. And then she was alone. For over 40 minutes, the footage showed nothing but trees. Luna sat still for most of it, surrounded by silence, sketchpad in hand. At one point, she seemed to realize she'd been misled. Her expression didn't change much, just her breathing. Shallow, controlled. Eventually, the wheels turned again. Slow, careful, deliberate. She found the group only after they'd returned to the bus. No one asked where she'd gone. The final seconds of the video showed her sitting by the rear wheel of the bus, sketching with quick, angry strokes. The drawing, which she gave to Shaq later that day, was of a forest, beautiful, wild. But in the center, a girl sat in a wheelchair surrounded by trees shaped like faces with no mouths. Shaq watched the footage twice, then a third time. Then he turned off the screen. He didn't speak to anyone that night, didn't respond to messages. He sat in the dark of his living room, with the sketch in one hand and the drive in the other. This wasn't just bullying, it was a performance, a ritual of exclusion disguised as adolescent mischief. The systems protecting it weren't broken. They were designed to do exactly what they were doing, and Luna's silence had become part of the town's routine, a convenient quiet they could pretend didn't hurt. Shaq could have released the video immediately. The footage would go viral. The outrage would erupt. But he didn't want outrage. He wanted reckoning. He started preparing, quietly, methodically. He edited the videos, not to dramatize but to clarify. Each clip was time-stamped, cross-referenced with school calendars, aligned with incident reports. He created a voiceover, simple, even-toned, deliberate. Not an attack, a mirror. In the background he layered Luna's sketches, animated slightly, pulsing gently behind the footage, like memories rising through water. He wanted people to feel the silence, to sit with it, to squirm inside it. But he didn't post it. Not yet. He saved the file, locked it, and titled it simply, "This is Cedar Hills." Then he waited, because he knew the town would give him the moment he needed. They always did. It started with questions. Not accusations, not warnings, just simple inconvenient questions delivered by a man who rarely raised his voice. Shaq didn't walk into the town hall with a mission to confront. He walked in with the calm of someone who'd spent enough time studying silence to know how to bend it. His presence alone shifted the air in the room. 7 feet of quiet resolve in a space filled with people used to being heard but rarely challenged. At the quarterly community update, tucked between budget allocations and an enthusiastic plug for the upcoming harvest parade, Shaq stood and asked about youth safety programs. He asked how many complaints were officially processed by the school district in the last year. He asked about disciplinary transparency, student protections, and staff accountability. He didn't name names. He didn't mention Luna. But he didn't need to. The temperature of the room changed with every word, and people felt it. He spoke only once that night, but his words echoed, not just in the room, but in kitchens, parking lots, and small circles over coffee. What does safety really look like when those who need protecting are the ones we refuse to see? Some brushed it off, others didn't. Over the next week, he began showing up more, not as the celebrity or mentor, but as the citizen who refused to play along. At the school board meeting, he brought up inconsistencies in how reports were handled. He cited public policy, not emotion. At the library's parent discussion group, he listened more than he spoke, then asked a single question. When was the last time this town stood up for a child who couldn't speak for themselves? The murmurs began there. Cedar Hills was no longer sleeping. Whispers filtered through the town like pollen on wind. Some called him brave. Others called him reckless. Some said he was stirring things that should stay buried. Others leaned in, quietly relieved that someone had finally said out loud what they'd only dared to think. At the cafe near the town square, conversations became quieter when Shaq walked in. Not out of fear, but calculation. Was he listening? Was he recording? People didn't know, and that made them careful. But behind closed doors, more voices began to emerge. A mother emailed Shaq a story about her son's sudden transfer after complaining of harassment. An older teacher, now retired, sent an unsigned letter detailing a list of complaints she was told to handle internally, or risk losing tenure. Another note arrived, this time hand-delivered, offering support. You're not wrong. Just be careful. They protect their own. And then, the resistance arrived. It came clean and sharp, just like he'd expected. The local paper ran a feature on Shaq's outsized influence on youth development, framing his mentorship as emotionally intense and agenda-driven. The article asked whether his celebrity legacy was clouding his judgment on matters better left to professionals. 2 days later, a podcast host connected to a local business coalition ran a segment speculating on Shaq's past debts. A man with money doesn't always mean a man with integrity, the host said. Charity's great, but sometimes it hides other motives. Online comments followed, carefully seeded. Why now? Where was this energy before? He's just trying to stay relevant. The word divisive surfaced again and again, and then came the political weight behind it all. Randall Danner. The councilman's voice returned to the public with strategic sharpness. In a televised statement about community unity, he praised Cedar Hills as a model of progress and warned against those who sow unrest for personal gain. He never said Shaq's name, but the implication dripped from every syllable. Behind the scenes, Danner's influence sharpened. Shaq's after-school reading program was quietly suspended pending evaluation. A grant he'd applied for, previously approved, was suddenly under review. A business he partnered with for youth internships pulled out, citing brand clarity concerns. None of it was coincidence. All of it was message. And yet Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't respond publicly. No interviews. No rebuttals. He kept showing up. Quiet. Calm. Unmoving. He still rode his bike. Every morning. Still visited the park. Still nodded at neighbors. Even as their smiles faltered. But the looks changed. Some filled with unease. Others with something closer to admiration. Reluctant but undeniable. The town had split. Not down the middle, but in cracks that spread underfoot. Parents who'd once chatted across fences now crossed streets to avoid awkward run-ins. Teachers whispered in break rooms. Students began choosing sides, even if they didn't know what the lines were. And in homes after dinner, questions floated up in ways they hadn't before. What did he mean at the meeting? Is something wrong at the school? Do you think the Danners actually… Let's not talk about this. But they were talking. One afternoon during a mentoring session that had been quietly relocated to a church basement, Shaq spoke to a smaller group than usual. Fewer kids, fewer parents willing to be seen. But those who came stayed longer, asked harder questions. What if the people in charge don't care? One boy asked. Shaq didn't give the hopeful answer. He gave the honest one. Then it's on the people who do care to stay loud, even if they're outnumbered. Outside, Luna waited near the bench by the church steps. She didn't ask to be part of the group. She simply listened, sketchpad in her lap, drawing quietly as always. But that day, when Shaq walked past her, she handed him a new drawing. It was different. Not just darker, but more pointed. A town square filled with shadows, each building casting a figure in silhouette. At the center stood a figure not quite shaped like him. But the resemblance was there, only his shadow wasn't attached. It stood beside him, taller, watching. The message was clear. The town was watching. And more than that, he was being watched too. Shaq pinned the sketch to the inside of his notebook, right behind the timeline of Luna's father's disappearance, just ahead of the printout of the school's discipline policy. It reminded him why he wasn't fighting back publicly, why he hadn't released the recordings yet, because Cedar Hills didn't need outrage. It needed to see itself, clearly, in its most uncomfortable reflection. He didn't need to destroy Danner. He needed to show what had been allowed under his watch. And so, he waited. He let the tension grow. Because everyone in town knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. And when it came, it wouldn't be a scream. It would be the sound of truth, undeniable and quiet as wind through trees, sweeping through a town that thought itself untouchable. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, like broken teeth, warm, uneven, deceptive. The kind of light that should have felt calm, even golden. But to Shaq, it came with an edge. Something about that day felt wrong from the start. Not dramatic, just slightly off, like a familiar song being played just half a note too low. He noticed Luna hadn't shown up to the park that morning. It wasn't unusual for her to miss a day. But this time, there'd been no message, no folded sketch, no trace. Her absence felt loud, and her silence, which had always said more than most people's words, now felt like a vacuum, a warning. By late afternoon, the feeling bloomed into a certainty. He stopped by the diner where Luna's mother worked. The moment she saw him walk through the door, her body stiffened. She didn't wait for him to speak. "She's gone," she whispered, stepping out from behind the counter, apron half untied. Her hands shook. "I came home last night, and she wasn't there. Just her sketchbook on the table. And this." She handed Shaq a torn piece of paper. On it, drawn in Luna's unmistakable lines, was a bird, small, fragile, plummeting from the sky. Wings pulled in, eyes closed. At the bottom, faint and jagged, the words, "Sometimes flying hurts more than falling." Shaq took it in both hands. Something solid collapsing inside his chest. The girl who had survived so much, endured so much, had reached the end of something. And no one had noticed. No one but her mother. And now, him. The authorities were contacted, but the response was procedural. The school sent a "we hope she's found soon" message in the parent portal. A few teachers promised they'd keep an eye out. The town, which had politely tiptoed around Luna for years, now did the same with her disappearance. Glancing, whispering, then quickly turning away. They couldn't afford to feel her absence. Not when they'd spent so long pretending she wasn't really there. Shaq didn't wait. He began at her house. Small, weathered, tucked behind a gas station near the edge of town. He looked through the room she called hers. Walls lined with pinned drawings, charcoal dust staining the air. Each sketch was a clue, but one caught his eye. A map, rough, abstract, but unmistakable. It wasn't streets. It was trees. A trail sketched in winding strokes led to something that looked like a broken square. A structure. Shaq turned it sideways, upside down, and then he remembered. The old hunting cabin. Abandoned for years. Half sunken into the wooded stretch outside the Cedar Hills Preserve. He knew where she was. The drive took 10 minutes. The walk from the trailhead to the hidden turnoff took another 20. But his body moved without fatigue. Every root underfoot, every leaf crushed beneath his boots, felt like a heartbeat counting down. The forest was thick, but he knew the shape of it. Years ago, he'd ridden through here on a community bike trail, never imagining that one day, he'd be searching the underbrush for a child who had become more than just a cause. She had become a mirror. When he saw the cabin, it looked more like a memory than a building. Wood rotting at the corners, the porch sagging, windows dark. He moved slowly, cautiously. He didn't call out. He listened. Inside, the air was cold despite the sun. The light slashed through cracks in the boards, illuminating a space littered with fallen leaves, dust, and the sharp scent of time left alone too long. Then he saw her. In the far corner, beneath a single half-broken window, Luna sat curled on the floor, knees pulled in, head resting against her arm. Her sketch pad was beside her, and on its open page, another bird, this one tangled in brambles, bleeding from where its wings should have been. She didn't move. Shaq crossed the room in 3 steps, dropped to one knee beside her, checked her breathing. Shallow, but there. Her skin was cold, her lips pale. She hadn't been hurt. She hadn't been taken. She had left, willingly, silently. Her escape hadn't been a cry for attention. It had been a final act of exhaustion. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and held her there, not to warm her but to let her feel something. Weight, presence, care. She stirred slightly, not waking fully, but enough to exhale. Shaq lifted her gently, slowly, carrying her from the dark into the light. As he stepped out of the cabin, the sun caught on her sketchpad, still in his hand. The drawing of the wounded bird shimmered faintly, and he realized what it meant. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was asking to be seen, one last time, without having to scream for it. He got her to the hospital without incident. She'd gone without food, barely water for 2 days. Her body was weak, her spirit thinner still. But she would recover. That much they told him. A nurse commended his timing. She was hours away from something irreversible. But the damage had already been done, not by the woods, or by the cold, or by the isolation. It had been done long before in classrooms where teachers glanced and said nothing, in hallways where her name was a punchline, in parks where she sat alone while the world passed by like she wasn't there. Shaq sat beside her bed that night, the monitors humming steadily, the light dimmed to soft amber. Luna didn't wake, but her breathing deepened. She was in that fragile place between presence and absence. He held her sketchpad in his lap and turned the pages slowly. There were so many drawings, some raw, others graceful, but one stopped him cold. It wasn't the usual birds or trees or girls in wheelchairs made of steel. It was him, drawn in graphite. His frame filled the page, one hand outstretched, not reaching to someone, but catching something, falling. Below the hand, drawn in blue, a shape plummeted. The girl, the bird, Luna. The drawing didn't show impact, just the moment before, the pause in gravity, the chance to catch or let fall. That was when it broke. Not his composure, not his strategy, but his waiting. The patience that had defined his every move. The calm, measured planning snapped under the weight of that image. He had tried to give the town the chance to see, to shift, to choose decency, but they hadn't chosen anything. They had waited, and in doing so they had nearly let a child disappear. He stood that night, not with rage, but with resolve. He didn't need fists. He didn't need speeches. He needed truth. And now, he had it. The recordings, the drawings, the silence, the fracture. The town thought it had time to decide where it stood. It didn't. Because tomorrow, Shaq would show them. Not what had happened in the woods, but what had been happening every day before the woods. Every hallway, every meeting, every moment they chose comfort over courage. The truth wouldn't be loud. It would be undeniable. The video moved gently, almost reverently, into the footage clips carefully cut, layered with subtle ambient sound. No dramatic strings, just the occasional shuffle of footsteps, the distant chatter of hallways, the click of a pencil on a desk. In one frame, Chase Danner laughed as a smaller student picked glitter out of their hair. In another, Brody hovered behind Luna's wheelchair, mimicking her posture while Griffin filmed. Faces were visible, actions clear, but no names were spoken, no arrows pointed, just observation. Then came the classroom scenes. Subtle but chilling, a teacher looking away as Luna was bumped. A guidance counselor, nodding dismissively, as a student gestured toward a drawing with bruised eyes. Each moment more damning in its mundanity. And then the forest. The clip slowed slightly, capturing the moment Luna's wheels turned down the wrong path. Chase's hand gesturing toward the trail, then pulling back like he'd never been there. Luna alone. The leaves closing in. The silence swallowing her whole. Shaq's voice returned, quieter now. You didn't fail her because you didn't see. You failed her because you did, and chose not to speak. I'm not here to punish. I'm here to reflect. What you see is what we let happen. As the final clip faded, the screen cut to black. Then one last image. A sketch. Luna. The falling bird. Simple. Stark. Unforgettable. And beneath it 5 words. What we ignore, we become. By noon it had gone viral. The original upload had less than 1,000 views before someone shared it to a national education forum. Within hours, news outlets picked it up. Hashtags trailed it like flames. This is Cedar. The bird fell. Protect the invisible. Former students from Cedar Hills Academy began commenting, sharing their own experiences. Some used their names, others didn't, but the thread was the same. Overlooked cruelty, protected privilege, the long burn of silent neglect. By evening, the video had passed 1 million views. That night, Shaq didn't go online. He sat at Luna's bedside. She was awake, drawing, her hand steadier now. She didn't say much, didn't have to. She knew. He handed her a printed frame from the video, the final shot of her drawing. She stared at it for a long time. Then, softly, they saw it? He nodded. They did. Her lips didn't move, but something in her eyes relaxed. Not completely, but enough. By the next morning, 2 teachers had resigned. One issued a public apology in a handwritten letter posted to a telephone pole outside the school. I knew. I didn't act. I'm sorry. The school board called an emergency meeting. For the first time, parents who'd never attended filled the room, demanding transparency. Councilman Danner responded the way powerful men often do, with press statements. He dismissed the video as selective editing and emotional manipulation, called it an unfortunate hit piece. But the usual effect, the dampening of truth, didn't work this time. Because the image of Luna, alone in the woods, didn't fade. Because the sketches, now displayed in the town's small art gallery after a community member offered to curate them, were no longer just drawings. They were witnesses. The collection, titled Unseen, featured 20 of Luna's pieces, all created before the video dropped. Visitors came from neighboring towns, some from out of state. The gallery stayed open late. People stood in front of the sketches, eyes wet, mouths still. They didn't talk while they looked. They listened. Chase wasn't arrested. Brody and Griffin didn't face formal charges. There were no courtrooms, no headlines of justice served in the traditional sense. But something far subtler and deeper changed. Their scholarships were rescinded, college admissions flagged. Their names, once floated proudly in parent groups, became hushed. Their future wasn't destroyed, but the glow was gone. They weren't villains. They were cautionary tales. Shaq never spoke their names. Not in interviews. Not in posts. Not in conversation. He didn't have to. He let the video, the silence, and their choices speak. As for the town, it didn't transform overnight. But the fault line had split wide enough that no one could pretend anymore. Committees formed. Parents pressed harder. Teachers watched more closely. Students began documenting their own stories. The quiet wasn't gone, but it wasn't safe anymore. Shaq declined every major network interview. He issued one statement, posted from a plain white background. This was never about one girl. This is about every place that mistakes silence for peace. And every person who thinks kindness is optional. You don't have to be loud. You just have to see. And then he returned to the park, to the bench, where Luna now sat, sketching as usual. But no longer alone. And for the first time, she was drawing birds, not falling, not bleeding, but flying. The seasons turned slowly in Cedar Hills, as if the town itself hesitated to admit change. Autumn's colors dulled early that year. The reds weren't as bold, the yellows more muted, like even the leaves were unsure whether they had permission to transform. The breeze still carried warmth, but it arrived heavier, laden with unspoken reckonings. People moved differently now. Not drastically, not in the way that demanded headlines or banners, but in small, unmistakable ways. Conversations quieted near the fountain. Teachers no longer glanced away during tense moments. In the classroom, some parents sat in on school board meetings without being asked, and on park benches where once there had been laughter at someone else's expense, there was now room for pause. Shaq saw it all, from the same spot each morning, his routine unchanged. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't want it. He just kept showing up, riding his bike, mentoring, sitting quietly, still as tall as ever, but somehow even more grounded now. His presence, once comforting, had become something else, a reminder. Luna was drawing again. Every day, her sketches were different now, less abstract, less shrouded. They held storylines, layers. Her art had become a kind of coded conversation with the town, hung in the gallery, passed between hands, even stapled to the back walls of classrooms. Without speaking, she was teaching everyone how to see. Then came the morning Chase returned. He wasn't expected. He wasn't missed. For months he'd vanished from school, from public events, from the places he once claimed like a stage. His family had retreated into quiet denial, issuing brief statements to support a time of healing while avoiding direct contact with anyone asking real questions. Randall Danner's re-election campaign had quietly stalled. His social circle had thinned. The family name, once spoken with admiration, was now associated with discomfort, not guilt, just unease, the kind that grows when consequences don't arrive in sirens, but in mirrors. When Chase reappeared, he looked smaller. Not physically, he still stood tall, broad-shouldered, but something in his posture had changed. His eyes no longer scanned the park with dominance. They stayed low, fixed on the ground or the horizon. He walked with careful steps, the kind taken by people who are no longer sure of their place in the world. Shaq noticed him from across the square, but didn't move. He watched. Chase approached the fountain slowly, a folded note in one hand. He paused at the bench, her bench, then looked around. Not nervously, not cautiously, just searchingly, like someone who knew they couldn't undo anything, but still needed to be seen trying. He placed the note gently on the wood, beneath a small stone, the way Luna often anchored her sketches. Then, without lingering, he turned and walked away. Shaq waited until he disappeared down the path before approaching. The note wasn't long. Luna, there's nothing I can say that deserves an answer. You were never the joke. I was. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I remember. And I'm sorry. CC. Shaq didn't take the note with him. He left it there. Later that afternoon, Luna arrived, as she always did, sketchbook in her lap, eyes alert. She noticed the note, picked it up, read it once. Her face didn't change. She didn't sigh. She didn't smile. She folded the paper and tucked it inside her sketch pad, without ceremony. Then, with a soft breath, she pulled out a fresh page and began to draw. It was one of the longest sketches she'd spent time on in weeks. Shaq watched from a distance, unsure if she was processing or simply creating. Her pencil moved with controlled energy, as if she knew exactly what had to come out. The next morning, a new drawing hung on the gallery wall. It didn't have a title. It showed a figure, unmistakably Chase, walking across a wide, empty field. Behind him trailed ghost-like forms. Children, teenagers, some with distorted features, others with hollow expressions. They weren't screaming. They weren't attacking. They were simply following, close, silent, watching. Their shadows stretched across the ground, overlapping his. The figure's head was down. His arms were open, not in welcome, but in surrender. Beneath the image, in small print, Luna had written one line. We never walk alone, not even after. The town saw it, and it stayed with them. No one knew what happened to the note. Luna never spoke of it. Chase was seen from time to time, shopping for groceries, volunteering at the shelter, walking alone. No one harassed him, but no one praised him either. That was the change. The pedestal had been removed. The silence once given to protect him was now replaced by a kind of measured distance. Not cruelty, not exile, just clarity. He had to carry it now. All of it. Shaq understood the weight of carrying things. Not just shame, but the responsibility of choosing what to do with it. He never spoke to Chase. Never approached. The message had been delivered. The response had been given. There was nothing left to say. But still the town watched. And in watching, they learned. Slowly. Policies shifted. The school introduced anonymous reporting tools. Art was given space in the curriculum again. Teachers were required to complete empathy training. These were not dramatic overhauls. No parades, no applause. But they were real. And real change never came in grand speeches. It came in the space between who people were and who they were willing to become. The gallery extended Luna's exhibit for another month. Then two. A traveling curator offered to take it statewide. She declined. She wasn't interested in touring pain. She wanted to stay in Cedar Hills. Not because it was healed, but because it was still listening. Shaq kept his distance from the growing attention. He didn't need credit. He'd already gotten what he came for. Not redemption, not validation, but the soft, barely visible shift of a community beginning to look inward. And once a town starts looking inward, it can no longer pretend it never saw. That, more than anything, was the win. Not the viral video, not the gallery, but a single boy once invincible, now walking with his eyes to the ground, surrounded by shadows he finally recognized. Kindness is courage, in memory of the unheard, in honor of those who listened. The plaque hadn't been suggested by Shaq, nor Luna. It had been the idea of a 6th grade class, led by a teacher who once looked away too often, but now looked harder than anyone. The town council had approved it unanimously. Shaq stared at the inscription for a while, letting the words settle. They weren't profound because they were clever. They were profound because they were simple. Because kindness, in a place like Cedar Hills, in a world like this one, really did take courage. It wasn't soft. It wasn't easy. It meant risking comfort. It meant seeing things you wanted to ignore. It meant changing. He leaned back, the bench creaking beneath his weight, and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to breathe. He had spent months in motion, uncovering, exposing, enduring. There had been times he'd questioned the value of it all, times he'd wondered whether the weight of truth was worth the backlash. But as he sat there hearing Luna laugh for the first time, a soft, surprised sound when a little boy tripped and giggled beside her, he knew it had been worth it. This was never about justice in the legal sense. No one was jailed, no courtrooms convened. But Cedar Hills had become a place where people spoke with less fear, where kids with different abilities weren't just accommodated, they were included, where art was no longer extra credit, but part of how students processed the world. And still, the town remained itself. The buildings hadn't changed. The trees hadn't grown differently. There were still Sunday brunches, carpool lines, and homeowners arguing about recycling bins. But underneath it all was a new pulse. Shaq hadn't tried to lead a movement. He hadn't drafted petitions or launched fundraisers. All he'd done was reflect. He'd held a mirror up to Cedar Hills and said, "This is who we are. What now?" That was always the part that mattered. The what now. Some people still looked at him with uncertainty. They smiled, but cautiously, not because they feared him, but because he reminded them of the time they didn't act, of what they allowed. And shame is a quiet thing. It doesn't scream. It just lingers, until it finds purpose. He saw that purpose now in strange, unexpected places. He saw it in the high school drama department, now running workshops with students to write their own one-act plays, some of them based on Luna's drawings. He saw it in the New School Initiative. The Unseen Are Still Here, a peer-led support program for marginalized voices. He saw it in the grocery clerk who once turned away from Luna in the checkout line, now kneeling beside her to ask about her latest gallery piece. And he saw it in Chase, still walking the long road between what he was and what he hoped to become. He worked part-time now at the town's community garden. Quiet work, soil and sweat, nothing performative. He didn't try to be noticed. But Shaq noticed, and Luna had noticed too. Her latest sketch of him, displayed in the library's community art board, showed a man with a watering can, planting small twisted saplings. The shadows behind him still followed. But in this piece, they weren't haunting him. They were watching him grow. Shaq hadn't spoken with Chase. He didn't plan to. Not because there was resentment, but because growth doesn't need an audience. It needs space. The wind picked up slightly, rustling leaves along the walkway. A group of teenagers passed by on their way to the recreation center, one of them waving at Shaq. He waved back. A mother pushing a stroller slowed, nodded, kept moving. The rhythm of the town pulsed forward, ordinary and extraordinary at once. Luna rolled closer, pausing beside the bench, a fresh drawing in hand. "Wanna see?" she asked, her voice stronger now. Still soft, but no longer afraid of its place in the air. Shaq nodded. She handed it to him. It was the fountain, but not how it looked that day, how it felt. In the sketch, the light danced across the water like music. Children played in motion-blurred joy. And in the background, barely visible, was the outline of a girl sketching, and a giant man watching quietly, not overseeing, not guarding, just being. "It's the first time I drew myself without being stuck," Luna said, almost to herself. Shaq held the drawing gently, then met her eyes. "That's because you're not." She smiled again, this time wider. The stillness of the moment wasn't empty. It wasn't silence like before, the kind that covered things. This stillness was earned. It was the pause that comes after the storm, when the world exhales and dares to believe in itself again. Cedar Hills would never be perfect, but it was listening now. And sometimes, that's all it takes. As for Shaq, he didn't need monuments. He didn't want recognition. He wasn't the storm. He wasn't the hero. He was the mirror. And that wasn't because the mirror didn't change the world. It just made it impossible to ignore the truth any longer. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. If this story made you feel something, don't scroll past it. Share it. Start a conversation. Look closer at your own community and ask, who's still sitting alone by the fountain? Change doesn't need noise. It needs noticing. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.